So let's dive into a little bit more sensitive part of the discussion of the underclass and the poor. Why are people part of that class? How do they end up there? Why is somebody who is poor poor? Now, I mean, since I talk about this all the time, since I talk about socioeconomic status, I think in every single course I've ever taught at the university, I could come up with a number of reasons. But sticking with this course, all of the possible explanations for why some people are poor and some are not, why some families seem to be almost trapped in poverty generation after generation and some are not, boil down to two basic choices. Either we view this as a result of they themselves or as a result of the society they live in. Looking at individual focused explanations, to put it in a very unacademic way, it's their own fault. Either because of their own action or inaction, or because they were born differently, or both. The main point is that they've created this life for themselves. They are where they are because of their own failings. And the natural implication as an extension of this is that they should not be viewed with as much sympathy or empathy as they are. And since both the United States and Canada are countries that have a definite tendency to lean towards individualism, to encourage individualism, this fits with what many think, whether they admit it or not, because it's often not considered a terribly politically correct explanation. This is typically a more politically conservative perspective. In the US, supported more likely by Republicans, and in Canada, more likely supported by the Progressive Conservative Party. Now, in putting the responsibility for being poor directly on poor people themselves, we can even be more specific and state that they've been born a certain way that makes them more likely to be poor, or they've been raised in a certain way that makes it more likely for them to be poor. A biological explanation or a cultural explanation. And a biological explanation used to be much, much more common. Believing that some people are just not as intelligent as others. They're more simple. That their mental capacity and reasoning are not as fully developed as other people's, or even that their basic character is lacking. And if somebody's born this way, biologically or genetically, they're deficient. Of course, they're not going to do as well as other people in life. This is known as a biological deterministic explanation. It's a survival of the fittest explanation, a social Darwinism explanation, and an extremely politically incorrect one to state that some people are just born more equipped than others. Some people are born better than others. Whether you agree with this idea or not, whether you are stringently opposed to this idea or not, let's just talk about it for a minute. Consider for just a moment that it's true, that there is in fact a genetic reason why some people end up being really poor while others are not. That would make being poor for some people inevitable, a kind of natural development, a natural evolutionary process. And it would also mean that if being poor was the result of a natural process, that it's not possible to help anybody out of poverty. This is what Herbert Spencer thought. He actually coined the term survival of the fittest before Darwin ever used it. And if you ever take a classical sociological theory course, I guarantee you'll study Spencer. And if you really believe this, then what would be the point of social policies and social reform and different programs and funding all of those? Because if this is the way people are born, that's the way people are born and you can't change it. So as I said, a very politically incorrect explanation for why some people are poor and some people aren't. A very uncomfortable explanation, and one that has not been widely supported or even believed for some time. Although the basic ideas of a biological explanation have not completely disappeared, as research involving the link between a person's IQ and their genetic makeup has continued. In a book called The Bell Curve, Intelligence and Class Structure in American Life, written by Richard Herrnstein and Charles Murray in 1994, they said that intelligence is influenced by two main things: environmental factors and inherited biological factors, your genetics. They said these two factors are a better outcome of certain things like income as an adult, job performance, even whether somebody will become a parent without being married, or the possibility of them being involved in crime. They said these two factors of environment and biology are more important determinants of a person's socioeconomic status than their status in their family of origin. And because of this, what they called the cognitive elite are clearly separated from those of average intelligence or below average intelligence. As you might anticipate, this was extremely controversial, stating that some people are simply born smarter and raised in a better way. This was controversial not just in academic circles, it managed to make its way into more mainstream news and talk shows. And there was even an entire book published in response to it, called The Bell Curve Debate, 1 year later in 1995. And this contained 81 articles from different authors, compiled by one of the original authors. So the publisher of the response book said that it captured the fervor, anger, and scope of an almost unprecedented national argument over the very idea of democracy and the possibility of a tolerant, multiracial America. It is an essential companion and provides scholarship and polemic from every point of view, end quote. I want to be very clear, is it acceptable and correct to state that individual people differ in their basic intellectual capabilities? Absolutely. People have different levels of intelligence. Is it okay to say that some people seem to have been born with natural abilities? Absolutely. The problem is, and this is a problem not just saying because it's politically incorrect. No, it's incorrect to say that belonging to one particular group will affect a person's intelligence, whether that's their socioeconomic status or race or ethnicity or gender or sexual orientation or national identity or whatever it is. It is incorrect to say, for example, that somebody of a particular ethnicity is more or less intelligent because of it, or that somebody of a particular class is more or less intelligent because of it. That's totally incorrect. And this is why the social sciences as a whole do not support a biological deterministic point of view, nor does our population as a whole. But there does remain quite strongly a biologic deterministic-ish tinge in some political and social policies that suggest people who are poor receive too much assistance. If they just put more effort in, they would do better and not be poor. They're naturally lazy and they take advantage of any assistance provided. And you can see examples of this when a politician is asked for their stance on a particular social program or why they want to decrease funding for a program. They have to be very, very, very careful in how they phrase their perspective. So this is all part of an individual-focused explanation for why somebody is poor. And in addition to this, one that's garnered more acceptance is the idea of a culture of poverty, which is focused more on the environment. So this is still a theory of poverty based on individuals. It states that people who are poor have a particular kind of culture encompassing certain norms and values that is characteristic of the poor. This culture of poverty that they learn does not fit with mainstream society. Its norms and values are different from mainstream society. And because of that, when somebody is raised within the culture of poverty, they just cannot fit into mainstream society. So I kind of took a few quotes from the book and then combined them to come up with this statement. They are attuned to a dysfunctional culture that makes it difficult and sometimes impossible to assimilate with mainstream culture. So I kind of combined two sentences from your text. I talk about this specifically in one of the sociology of education courses quite a bit, as one of the theories explaining why inner city low-income students have so much difficulty fitting within the typical structured education system. Now, Oscar Lewis was an anthropologist who developed this concept, and he said, quote, "The subculture of the poor develops mechanisms that tend to perpetuate it, especially because of what happens to the worldview, aspirations, and character of the children who grow up in it," end quote. What he did was he went to several cities, and he simply studied the poor living there, beginning with Mexico City in 1959. And he said, sure, in many ways, the poverty that poor people experienced was imposed on them. But this then, in turn, led to the formation of a subculture, as children were socialized into behaviors and attitudes that perpetuated their inability to escape the underclass. So he first referred to this as the subculture of poverty, and then it was just changed to the culture of poverty. So this is more than just socialization, although socialization is part of culture. Remember that culture, any culture, is multifaceted, and it includes music, language, art, customs, habits, knowledge, social behavior, beliefs, norms, values, capabilities, expectations. Culture includes social institutions, lifestyles, ways of living, sometimes laws, sometimes religious beliefs. Culture is not singular. And when you say somebody's socialized to act a certain way or to be a certain way, you're not saying one singular thing, but that one singular thing of socialization is extremely complex. Edward Banfield agreed with Dr. Lewis, and he was an American political scientist who is best known for his broken windows theory, which says, when there are visible signs of crime in a neighborhood, antisocial behavior, and general civil disorder, these create a kind of urban environment that encourages further crime and disorder, including serious crime. So with this in mind, police would target minor crimes that do not seem very important in the grand scheme of things like vandalism, loitering, public drinking, jaywalking. If they would focus on that and target these smaller crimes, it will help to create an atmosphere of order and lawfulness. So in regards to the culture of poverty, Dr. Banfield focused more specifically on the Black urban poor and on how he said they would not adopt middle-class values. And he was specific that he did not see this as a racial issue. This was a class issue. Because he said once they adopted middle-class values, once they assimilated to and encompassed middle-class values, which would occur over time, they would break free from a culture of poverty. Now, does the culture of poverty still blame poor people for being poor, but just in a kind of nicer way? In a not so direct way that's still saying the same thing, but it's just more politically correct? Some would say yes. You can phrase it any way you want, but what the culture of poverty does is still blame poor people for being poor. It still blames poor people for not doing what they should do to be middle class. Others would say that this culture of poverty that is used as an explanation for poverty is not a culture that is supported. It's a coping mechanism that's emerged because of the situation people find themselves in. And a coping mechanism is very different from a culture. For argument's sake, let's say the theory of poverty and all that is 100% true. Then why are some poor people not poor when they grow up? This is just proof to some people that it's the culture of poverty is not the big explanation that everybody seems to be looking for to explain poverty. And even so, the dominant view, the dominant public perception, is that poor people are poor because of their own doing, and that's all there is to it. Even the poor themselves are much more likely to express support for this perception that people get what they deserve, which really is a different way of expressing support for the stereotypical American dream that anybody can be anything. Because belief in the American dream necessarily includes the belief that if somebody does not put in the work and effort, they're not going to amount to much. These people are considered the undeserving poor, people who are where they are because they are lazy and irresponsible. So, individual-focused explanations of poverty include a biological survival of the fittest possibility and the culture of poverty. Another perspective is that social structural conditions have significantly contributed to their position in the underclass. So, for example, the fact that it's become more and more difficult to obtain a half-decent job without an education or specific skills. It's a structural condition that many corporations and factories have sent work overseas. That urban areas have in turn crumbled bit by bit because of a lack of employment. That education in inner city urban areas tends to be of an inferior quality. From this perspective, sure, it's easy to blame individuals. That's the easy way out. But a structural explanation would say that's overly simplistic and simply incorrect. So if we look at a structural explanation for the underclass and the poor, that they have not been provided the same education opportunities as mainstream society, or the same opportunities to gain skills, and to say this is why the majority do not work and are poor, this is looking outside the individual. A structure-focused explanation of poverty routinely and absolutely includes the cycle of poverty. And the cycle of poverty refers to how the social institutions in a society sustain and perpetuate poverty within that society. The government, the education system, the healthcare system, the economy, etc. The cycle of poverty refers to how generations of families get caught in poverty, generation after generation after generation, so that certain things just repeat themselves. So if I were to ask you to tell me in a very cut and dried, straightforward way why somebody is poor, the answer would be because they don't have much of an education. So they don't have a good job in terms of salary or benefits or chances for advancement, and thus they don't make much money. That's the answer in a nutshell. And that is correct. But this answer demonstrates how all three factors in this explanation are completely 100% related to each other, how they cause each other. They are a cycle. So that when these people have children, if they have children, because they don't make much money, they live in a low-income neighborhood with inferior schools, so their children are highly unlikely to have a good quality education or to gain a higher education. And the cycle begins again with the next generation. So when I have here the two ways that the cycle of poverty works, it works within the cycle, but the second way it works is to have a generational effect. And for those that do work, every generation finds himself in a dead-end job, a job with no hope of advancement and no hope of a higher salary. And every aspect of their life is affected. Neighborhood, housing, schools, healthcare, mental health care, a lack of opportunity for themselves and their children, a lack of ability to save for retirement, a lack of access to good legal services or advice if needed. And then there is the public perception and discrimination that accompanies their socioeconomic status. And then there are the kind of invisible things that we just wouldn't think of, that don't really come to your mind as your text indicates. Having to pay more insurance for your residence or a car because of where you live. As I've already said a few times, having to pay more for groceries because of where you live and what is available, that food desert in urban areas. Being much less likely to be approved for any kind of loan through a bank. So the cycle of poverty is just that. And I tend to like to have visuals in my head when it comes to important concepts. And for me, when I think of the cycle of poverty, I always picture a really sticky spider web. A web that in every sense traps people so that no matter how hard they try and how much they struggle, that it's almost completely impossible to get out of poverty. and then their children become stuck in this web as well. So that is the cycle of poverty, which is a structure-focused explanation for the poor. Another kind of structure-focused explanation simply refers to the economy specifically. Because we live in a capitalist economy in which the main goal of companies and factories and every single business is to make as much money as possible, keep expenses down and profits up as much as possible. Pretty straightforward. And that would be the goal of any business, no matter how big or how small it was. Okay, that makes sense. But what living in a capitalist economy means is that the welfare of individual workers really does not factor into decision making, unless it's to figure out a way to save money where workers are concerned. So businesses will hire a lot of part-time employees instead of fewer full-time employees because it's cheaper. Maybe they'll move their business to where expenses are cheaper. They can create jobs in an area, but they can also eliminate jobs in an area, and there's nothing employees can do about it. I'm going to refer again to major vehicle manufacturers moving their plants from areas where they were the main employers, such as in Detroit, which was always known as the Motor City because manufacturing vehicles was so important and such a huge part of the city. So here we have pictures of the Packard automotive plant in Detroit. Look at the size of this plant. It's massive. But Detroit has undergone massive deindustrialization as industrial jobs, and thus the capital they bring, have moved elsewhere. The majority of people who worked at these plants were not highly educated, they were not highly skilled, but the plants still provided thousands of lower middle class jobs for them. And when the plants closed down, there were thousands and thousands of people out of work with little education and little to no skills, because their job at the plant only taught them skills that were useful at that plant. So, for example, keeping in mind, I'm completely making this up because my knowledge of how a vehicle is constructed is less than zero. Let's say I worked at a plant that made cars and I was on the door production line. Those are not skills that are transferable elsewhere. So what happens when these plants close down? The entire surrounding neighborhood is hit, as all of these people out of work, everybody's selling their home and moving elsewhere is not an option for most because everybody's selling and nobody's buying. Property values plummet, surrounding businesses decline as people have less money. So if at all possible, they move, taking their taxes with them. The entire community declines and deteriorates. The majority rely completely or in part on government assistance, and it's extremely difficult to get the cycle of perpetual decline to reverse.